was born July 16th, 1930 in Taylor, Arizona to Ryle Freeman and Florence Staniford. I spent a little bit of time there, and then my parents moved to White River when I was just a few months old and spent time there. And I don't know when they decided, well, I do know when they decided to move back to Taylor. My father had a nervous breakdown. He'd had a goiter operation previously, and his hormones were out of whack, and they moved back to Taylor because he had this nervous breakdown, or not back to Snowflake. And they moved into a little log house at the end of the street by Grandma Freeman's. He run a trucking company, and I think they went back to White River and worked from there. Then he sold his trucking company and just drove the truck, but didn't own it. I spent a good part of my life the first 5 years of my life in Snowflake, in a little house down where the highway, the main highway, turns off to the Hebert Highway. It was on the north side of the northwest corner there. There was a little house there, and we lived in this little house. And the house only had one bedroom, so there was a bunch of us girls and the two brothers. So the brothers got the bedroom. We slept in the little house out back that was called the granary. And there was a cellar under there where they kept their fruit when they bottled their fruit and their vegetables, and this was where they preserved their food for the winter. We had a lot of fun. There was nobody out there to tell us what to do. There was nobody out there to tell us to quiet down and go to sleep. We just had a lot of fun. And there was two beds where my two younger sisters slept. My older sister and I slept in the other bed. Mother always had warm blankets over us in the wintertime. And there was a little stove out there, and the stove was called Big Ben. And my youngest sister that was sleeping out there, she was just, probably 3 years old or so at that time. And we built a fire and was warming up our little bedroom. And she wanted to get really warm, so she got really close to that stove and poked her tummy out and burnt Big Ben across his tummy. We loved to tease her about that. We teased her about it all her life, I guess. But it was a fun life, and we had big apple trees down at the end of this lot where this little house was on. We had the full run of the house, and there was a old outdoor privy down there just to the side of one of these big apple trees. And this big apple tree had a low stump where little kids could get up into that apple tree really easy, and we spent hours and hours in that apple tree. When blooms on the apples, the tree would come on and the little apples would begin to form, and there's still a blossom on the end of the apple. We would start eating the green apples. And I think we pruned that tree, so I really think that tree produced a lot better than it would have had we not been so many kids in there. And it wasn't only us, it was the neighbor kids, all of us. And they always had a really good crop of cooking apples off from that. It would service the whole that part of town, the relatives and everything that were in that part of town. And the place that we lived on belonged to my Uncle Taylor. And that was Mother's uncle, my grandmother's brother. And anyway, that was one of the special things in my life. I remember that apple tree. It was so special. Then I had a friend down the street. It was Velma Haywood, and her and I were bosom buddies. We spent most of our free time together. And I remember her coming up. She was going to spend the night with me. My folks locked up the house. We'd all gone to bed, and we decided we'd go uptown. So we opened the window and crawled out the window, went uptown. come back, crawled in the window. I don't know if the folks ever knew he'd gone or not. If they did, they didn't say anything. When we were living in this little house, my grandparents had a fourth of a lot up on the southeast corner of the main street, just a block above where this little house was. And my dad inherited one lot. They divided it in 3 lots for the 3 sons. My dad had the center lot since he was the center son. And his brother lived in Los Angeles, and he never would move back to Snowflake. He didn't want to move back to Snowflake. So my dad purchased his lot, and my parents decided to build a home there. And I must have been about 6 or 7 years old. But they started a home there. By the time I was 10 years old, we moved into that home, and that was quite a story because my mother they had 7 children in that 1-bedroom house with the granary for a bedroom. And so my mother decided, my father, of course, the Second World War had started, and my dad was out at Belmont working in the war effort. It was an ammunition dump out there where he worked. And he would come home once in a while on a weekend and do what he could on the house. And then he would go back, and it'd be a while before he'd get to come back again. And so this one weekend he'd come home, and the house was all built. It had its roof on. It had a subfloor in it. It had the windows in, but there was no doors. So my mother talked him into letting her move into the house. So he said, okay, she could move into the house. He started back to Belmont and got as far as Hobart and decided that was not a good idea, that he needed to stop her. So he come back to Snowflake to stop her, and everything was moved but the stove and the refrigerator. So he moved those, stayed home long enough to make a couple of barn door type doors to shut the doors. And Mother moved in the house, and we lived in that house unfinished for years because Dad would work, and then when he'd have a time to work on the house, usually at Christmas time, he would work on the house, and finally he got it finished to where we had a nice home. It was a nice home, very nice home, and it was really fun. I turned 8 years old, and then I turned 9 years old, and I still hadn't been baptized. Then I was coming home from the movie at the 2 o'clock movie at the theater, and the theater stood on the corner of the church lot, and we went through the church lot to get home, and there was these 2 men standing at the gate, and they said, "Is there anybody in this group that hasn't been baptized?" And I said, yes. And they said, well, you go home and you get your mother and you come back here and be baptized. So I went home and I got my mother. We went back there and I was baptized. And the man that baptized me turned out to be the husband of one of my dad's cousins. So the next day I was to be confirmed. Well, Mother and Dad's family was having a picnic out at Heber. So my mother said to me, well, Jeannine, you can go stay with Grandma Hunt and be confirmed today if you want to, or you can go with us to the picnic in Heber. So I chose to go to the picnic in Heber. Well, I didn't know what these things, So anyway, the next month I said, well, are you going to be, am I going to be confirmed this month? Yes, you are. But now, my mother and Dad were inactive. They made sure that we went to church. They made sure, not to church, to Sunday school. We were required to go to Sunday school. But to church, it was an option with us. Well, I didn't start going to church till I was about in high school. But this day, when I was to be confirmed, she told my sister, my oldest sister, now you go to church with Jeannine, and I'll send this note with her, and she can be confirmed today. So we started up the walk toward the church, which was about 2, 3 blocks from our house. We started by my grandparents' home, my Freeman grandparents' home, and my grandmother said, "Where are you girls going?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to church. I'm to be confirmed today." And Grandma said, "You wait a minute. You girls are not going alone. I'm going with you." So Grandma always was all dressed up like a lady. And so she come on out and she went to church with us that day. And when they asked, "Is there anybody to be confirmed today?" which they did in that day and age, I got up and walked up and I handed them my note. And they opened up my note and they said, "Would Brother Taylor Hunt please come up and confirm this girl?" Well, Uncle Taylor was my mother's uncle, and he had no notice that he was going to confirm me that day. But he confirmed me that day, and everything's worked out for the good and well-being, and he was a good man. But that was the surrounding about my baptism and confirmation. Well, when they called Uncle Taylor up to confirm me, he was quite didn't expect that. Quite a look on his face, but he got up and he did it, and he did a good job of it. But everybody in that day and age were baptized in their swimsuits. They didn't have clothing to baptize them in like they do now. And the baptismal font was in the church, but it was in the junior Sunday school. Well, it was junior Sunday school at that time, pretty much. And baptismal font was in the corner of that. And there was no cupboards or anything for clothing at all. You furnished your own. I loved my grandparents, my dad's parents, Grandma and Grandpa Freeman. James was Owen Freeman was his name, and he was the Justice of the Peace in Snowflake for about 35 years. But I loved living next door to him and to my grandmother. And my grandmother was Mary Ellen Rowe, and they always called her Nellie. And when I would come home from school, after school, I always would jump the fence and go over and spend the afternoon, what was left of it, with my grandparents. They would fill me in on their history. They knew the genealogy of nearly everyone that ever lived in Snowflake, and they would tell me all this genealogy about these people. And they had a testimony that was so strong of the church. And my grandmother in particularly would bear her testimony to me all the time, and talk gospel to me all the time. She loved the gospel, and she would let me, I don't know, I just learned so much from her about the gospel and about the genealogy of her people too, and of my grandfather's people. And to me, that was one of the most precious times of my life, was visiting with those two old people, and I just loved them dearly. But they had an old well out in the back. It was really a good well just out to the side of their house, and their house was a very unique house for that time. It had in that time, they had no refrigerators. And so they had they had these little places built that had burlap over them with shelves in it, and they were usually outside, and they would have a big pan or some big container, and they would fill this big container with water and punch little holes in it so the water would drip down over the burlap sides all day long and keep their food cool. Well, my grandmother, she was uptown. She had this little thing built in the side of her house, and she did not have to go outside to get her things out of her little so-called icebox refrigerator thing. Oh, we thought that was so cool. Every morning she would come out after she had cleaned her house, clean her little walkway that come out to her backyard, and sweep her backyard clean. Her backyard was always swept clean. She had a big lilac bush by the side of this little walkway and roses all the way around her house and a trumpet vine that grew clear to the top of this two-storied house. She had yards that were just beautiful. Her and my grandfather's garden never had a weed in it. Their outhouse that was out in the backyard was very fancy. It was quite large. It was what we called a three-holer in that day. It had a big hole for big people. It had a medium-sized hole for medium-sized people, and then down a little lower, there was a little hole for little people. And it set over an irrigation ditch, so it was always washed out. That outhouse was calcimined. If you know what calcimine is, it's like a cheap paint, white, every spring. And there was hollyhocks planted all around that outhouse. So that was that. It looked as pretty as a house almost. Anyway, then there was a path out there by my grandfather's garden, and his garden was just beautiful. There was currant bushes all down the fence lines. They were really farmers. They knew how to grow things. I don't know what happened to me. My plants don't grow like theirs did. It was a beautiful red brick house. As you come up to it, there was a concrete sidewalk with little steps that it had a concrete entrance to the house. Now, this house had been an old schoolhouse before my grandparents moved into it, and they remodeled it. They had a living room and a bedroom, and in the bedroom there was a stairwell that went up to the second floor, and there was a small bedroom on one side and a large bedroom on the other. The large bedroom was a girl's bedroom, and the small bedroom was a boy's bedroom. But oh, getting up those stairs was a trick. A small child's foot was about all that would fit on them. So you kind of went up sideways, and there was no banister to hang on to. It was scary. But then they had added on a back part to this, a lean-to kind of thing on the back of the house, and that was their family area and dining and kitchen area. And I don't know, Grandma just had a way of making everything she touched look nice. And it always looked so homey. She had her plants or indoor plants in there. They are always green. Nothing ever died around those two people. And then you step down into this kitchen's family room area. And I'll never forget the little, I guess they call them, what do they call them? Things where she kept her linen and her dishes. And she had a little thing on her that was like this thing I got on where the weather people, I love to watch that weather people, which one was out, was it going to rain, was it going to shine. It was so, and of course, like kids, it's always interesting. She had her cook stove. Her cook stove was an uptown cook stove because it had a reservoir on the end of the cook stove, and then you fill that with water. You'd build a fire in that, and it heated the water. So you always had water, and you always had water to cook with that was already warm. In that day and age, that was a real bonus because otherwise it was out of the well in the bucket, and you had to heat it on the stove. She just made that home look so comfortable, so nice. They had a sofa in there. It was just really a nice place to go and to visit. I love to visit those old people. The memories just really flow back. My grandmother, Stannerford, she died when I was about 5 years old, and I don't have very many memories of her, except the only thing that I really remember about her, I was a little girl, and we went up to visit her. And I wanted her to pick me up, and she said, "I can't today, dear, I've got a headache." And that just broke my heart because she couldn't pick me up. And when she passed away, my parents moved up to live in that house because my grandfather traveled a lot. He would go up into Wyoming and Montana and shear sheep about 6 months of the year. And it left his son, Uncle Speed, alone, and he was still in his senior year in high school. So Mother and Dad moved up there so my mother could take care of him as well as us kids. But we had Uncle Speed there, and we loved to tease him, and he would tease us back. I was talking to my older sister, and she said she remembers when they were building a fence out along the north side of the house, and we would tease him till he'd catch us and tie us to the poles. And we would scream and scream, and Mother would come out and tell him to let those girls go. But we were really to the bottom of it. But when that winter that it was up there, it was really a cold winter. The snow was deep, and I guess to a little person it was a lot deeper than it was to an adult. We walked to school, and there was a creek between us and the school. And they had this swinging bridge that went over the creek. Well, in the wintertime, it was just too dangerous to go over that swinging bridge, so we would go around down. It was a lot further to go by the car bridge to get over to the school. But I remember one time Granddad Freeman had a cousin that lived in Taylor, and we'd have to go by his house. And I was crying to the top of my voice, and Shirley was trying to quiet me, but his cousin Bert Allen heard us, and he come out and he got us, and he took us in his house, told his wife that we were cold and we needed to be warmed up, and so she got some of his old socks and made us some gloves so that our hands would be covered up while we went to school. Oh, we were so thrilled. But the teacher, when he got to the school, these little kids with these hands that were cold, she would take them out. And I remember her taking me out and rub our hands in the snow and rub them with a lot of friction, warm our hands up, and that would work. But it was really a cold and deep winter that winter. But in the summertime, when the weather was good, that swinging bridge, the wind would blow and it would swing back and forth. And I remember getting down on the floor of the swinging bridge and crawling across it because I didn't want to fall off in the creek. And of course, they had sides along, so you couldn't fall off, but I didn't trust them. And one day that we were coming home from school, and the girls across the street were I had one my age, and Shirley had one just younger than her, and we decided that we had to come home for lunch. So I think the older girls were to the bottom of it, that we decided that we wouldn't go back to school, that we would go play in the plum bushes down at the bottom of Granddad Staniford's field and Brother Shumway's field, and we just make them play houses and having a real good time down there. We looked down, there was a bank, kind of a cliff at the bottom of these fields that had been washed out from the creek when it flooded. And we could see the teacher and the principals walking up and down this creek. So we thought we better let them know that where we were. And Corrine and I were in the first grade, so we thought we were safe. School was already out. We could go home, but that principal, he fooled us. He took us and made us sit in the class with the sixth graders. We had to stay till 4 o'clock that day. But that was one of the things that we did. We learned a lesson that day. You didn't ditch school. I remember Granddad Staniford. When we were living in Taylor, the Christmas we were living in Taylor, it was Christmas Eve, and of course, like all little kids, we were really excited, and we were waiting. We thought we'd go to bed and be able to get up and have our Christmas the next morning, and all of a sudden, there was a big racket outside. You could hear bells ringing out there, and the front door burst open, and in comes Santa Claus. And he brought in all of these toys, and he kept yelling at his reindeer outside because they kept jumping around. We could hear them jumping around because we could hear the bells ringing on their harnesses, and it was so exciting. And they brought in all these toys for us, dolls for me, dolls for my older sister, and we were just, we couldn't imagine. It was one of the most memorable Christmases I ever had as a little child, and then we went to bed, and we were so excited that we couldn't go to sleep. We found out later that the reindeer was Aunt Becky Kay. She was out there ringing the bells. But it was so nice that these two older people had planned this for us kids. But Shirley and I were being real noisy because we couldn't go to sleep. We were still so excited. And he come up and he said, "You be quiet. Your mother's giving us a little baby for Christmas." And the next morning when we got up, we had a little brother. And my parents named him Aquila Owen after both of my grandfathers. And he passed away about 2 weeks later. It was a very, very cold winter, and he just didn't survive it. But then Granddad was a self-educated man. He had gone to the 4th grade in school and had to stop and work because in his day and age, the whole family had to work to make a living. He was a self-educated man, and he read a lot, a lot of books. He knew a lot about English language, and whenever we would use an incorrect word, he would correct us. And the 2 words that I really remember him getting after me for using was get and gist. It's not get, it's just get. It's not get. It's just, it's not gist. But I remember how correct that he used his language. But he would be gone pretty much through the summers up into Montana and Wyoming, traveling around. And he was such a good man. I had 3 uncles, and my mother's the 3 youngest brothers in that, the children in that family were boys. There were 6 girls first and 3 boys last. Well, these uncles were all unmarried, and of course they just spoiled us to death because we were the only grandkids in that area at that time. And I remember them one Christmas, they brought us all dolls. One Christmas I ended up with 4 dolls. I don't know how it happened, but I did. And the uncles were pretty much to the bottom of that. But when the Second World War come along, they were one of the first to enlist into the services. And 2 of them, they all took the test to go into the Air Force. 2 of them passed the test, but the youngest one was colorblind and he couldn't pass the test. So the 2 older ones went in, and the 2 older ones were on the same airplane over Germany and were shot down in 1943. The youngest one lived, and he was a good uncle. He was so good to us kids. And with Granddad, he was just a special man. He would come down and play with us kids. In fact, Granddad put me through nursing school. If it hadn't been for him, I don't know if I'd ever been able to have gone to school. He took the money that the government paid him for the insurance from these 2 sons that he lost in the service. He put myself, Dixie, and Marilyn and I through nursing school, and Dixie through business school. And then we paid him back after we finished our schooling. But he was very generous and very proud of us because we wanted an education, because that's what he wanted. He wanted to have a better education than he had the opportunity to have. He could do anything with his hands. And one time he got an opportunity to go and spend some time at the college at Fort Collins, Colorado, and he was so proud of that and so happy that he had been able to educate himself enough that he could qualify to do that. But he lived, he was quite old when he passed away. He'd been a widower for many, many years. He had been a temple worker. He had served the mission. I remember when Delbert and I were married, we went by to see him on his mission, and we had saved the top layer of our wedding cake, and we gave it to him and his companion. We stopped to visit him. He was so thrilled. But that's pretty much what I remember about Granddad. He didn't like us calling him Grandpa. He was Granddad. We did not call him Grandpa, or we got corrected. My dad was born on the 10th of March, 1903, in his grandparents' home. And he lived in Snowflake all of his life. However, he went to the grade school there, he went to the high school there. They had a football team, as I recall, and he always sat on the bench. Him and his buddies were sitting on the bench. They weren't playing on the team, but so him and his buddies decided that they would have their own football team. So they started having their own football team, and they were challenging the team from the school. So they got kicked out of school in his sophomore year. Well, he had a brother living in Los Angeles, and so his parents sent him to Los Angeles, where his brother was, and one of the other fellows went with him, and they worked in the shipyards, and he learned to weld and so forth in the shipyards in Los Angeles, and had an opportunity to go to University of Los Angeles to get a training in mechanics. So he spent time there and learned to be a mechanic, and then he come back to Snowflake and met my mother, and at that time he and my mother got married. Then his sister married Roy Daniel, and he was an engineer, electrical engineer. Well, Dad decided he wanted to have some training in that field, so he took a correspondence course with the University of Chicago, and got his I don't know what you'd call it. Anyway, he learned to be finished his course for an electrical engineer. Now, us kids didn't know anything about this until after my mother passed away, and we were going through the papers, my father's papers, my mother's papers, and found these certificates. My dad never said a word about it or ever talked about it at all. We knew he could do these things because he did. But he also was pretty much a jack of all trades because he built our home. He made it, and we had a nice home. He had the trucking company, as I talked about before, and then when he stopped working out of town at the end of the Second World War, he started driving trucks for the logging companies and the lumber companies around in that area from Overguard to McNary. And he drove trucks for years there. He worked in McNary also as a mechanic in their mechanic shop for a time, but he didn't like being away from the family, and he didn't. As soon as he could get back to driving truck, he did. I think after all of us kids were pretty much out of the house, he and my mother took over the laundry and the dry cleaning shop across the street, and they worked in that for quite a long time. And he could keep things running because of his mechanical abilities. He also was a handyman around Snowflake for fixing everybody's radios, their toasters, their anything electrical that needed to be repaired usually come to our house. And not in the dining room, we had a table that was stacked up with that stuff, and Dad would work on it at night, and he wanted us kids to be quiet, but we were kids, and that was a pretty hard job to do for us to be quiet. My dad was honest to a fault. I don't know if you can be honest to a fault, but he was honest with everyone. He could not stand anyone that was not honest. He could not stand a liar. That upset him very much to find out that someone had lied to him or been dishonest with him in any way. And that was one of the things that he did not like. Dirty jokes. He did not like anything that was. My dad could swear up a storm, but he didn't like anybody telling any dirty jokes around him. He did not like anything that was out of line in that way. Not only that way, but toward any woman or any, that would be very, very strict. I remember one time I come out of my bedroom in my petticoat, and he told me to go back in there and get some clothes on. But that was one thing he wanted. He was very modest in that respect. He had a violent temper when he got upset, very, very much. You give him every bit of what energy you had to perform that work to the best of your ability. That was one of his qualities. And he instilled that in us. When you went to work for a person, you worked and you didn't play. And both of my parents taught us kids to work. We didn't loaf. A typical Saturday at our house, you had to work. You got to get your work done. The girls, we had 2 rooms to clean. There was 4 girls. We had 2 rooms to clean. On one week, we cleaned our bedroom and the kitchen. The next week, we cleaned the bathroom and the living room. And before we could go anywhere, those rooms had to be cleaned. Even before we went to school, those rooms were cleaned. Then on Saturday, we would go through the cupboards in the kitchen and take everything out and clean all the cupboards out. And now I know why we never had any bugs. that we didn't get to go to the show. We had a show Wednesday and Saturday. And on Saturday, they had an afternoon matinee that we could go to the show if we got our work done. Well, one day I decided I was going to challenge Mother, and I'd probably get to go to the show anyway. And I goofed off, and I found out I didn't get to go to the show. My brothers and sisters all went because they got their work done, but I didn't. I learned a good lesson there. But that was pretty much the way Saturday was spent. And then Mother and Dad would go to the evening show. We'd go to the afternoon show, and then they'd go to the evening show. I remember one time, Mother wanted a special job done, and she had George and I do this special job. And if we could go to the 7 o'clock show. Well, the time come, and we went to the show, and the name of the show was The Body Snatcher and the Brighton Strangler. A double whammy. Well, George and I went to the show, and we sat through that show, and when we come home, it was about 2.5 blocks from our whole house to the theater. We run down the middle of the street all the way home just as fast as we could run. I never will forget that. But we didn't, no harm come to us when we got home. We were okay. He was 5'11". He was a small, slender man until he reached his 40 area, and then he increased in size, but he never did get very heavy. He was, well, I don't know. I can think of 3 grandsons. If you get the side view of them, you see my father. Lon is one, Mark is another one, and Ray McRae is another one. If you get the side view of those men, you can see my father. His hair was dark, but it was thin and receded. He never did go bald. His eyes were a gray, a steel gray, and he worked outside a lot, so he was tanned. My mother was born in Snowflake at her grandmother's home. She was this daughter of Aquila Frank Standiford and Eva Hunt. Both of their parents, his father was the Bishop of Taylor. Her father was the Bishop of Snowflake. I think they already lived in Taylor, and I think when she was able to go, that they went back to Taylor too. And she was raised in Taylor. She did her elementary school in Taylor and her high school in Snowflake. But she was, from what I've heard, she was a very beautiful woman, very beautiful, pretty young girl, and very popular. She, when my dad come back from California, I think he was about 22 years old, and he went to the dance in Taylor and fell in love with my mother immediately. And anyway, he courted her, and she did not finish high school either. But they were married on the 3rd of July in 1925. And then they lived in Snowflake for a while in the little building behind my Freeman grandparents' home. It was what they called a barber shop, because my grandfather Freeman was a barber, and he had this little barber shop that he had started in, but had then moved out of it and moved up on Main Street into a fancier place with more in the line of business. But they lived there until my oldest sister was born, Shirley. She was born the 6th of March, 1927, and her name was Shirley Fawn, after my mother. Then they lived there for a while until my grandmother had had a goiter and had it operated on in Salt Lake City. Well, my grandmother Freeman, my dad had this goiter too, and he had to go to Salt Lake and have his goiter removed, but it was one of the most dangerous kind of goiters that exists even today. There's 3 types of goiter, and he had all 3. They didn't expect him to live, and that's what caused his nervous breakdown when he lost his business. But then they come back. Let's see. Mom was expecting me at that time, and then I was born shortly after that. Mother was an excellent speller, which I did not inherit. She could spell anything. And she was a good mathematician. Not as good as my dad, but she was a good mathematician, and I didn't inherit that either. But Mom was an excellent seamstress. She made all of our clothes. She could make her own patterns. When she would see something or we would describe something that we wanted, she would make the pattern, and then she would cut it off and make our clothes to the pattern we had described to her. She was excellent in that respect. I didn't inherit that either, but she was, and a cook, very good cook. She was a very good cook, and I hope I inherited that. But anyway, she was just a good homemaker, a good mother. She taught us kids what we needed to do. And I don't know, Mother would tell us, we better do this or else. And or else is where she stopped. She didn't say or else what, but we never did find out what or else meant or what for meant. We just, we did it. But anyway, she was a very good person. She worked in the church. She worked in the primary. She worked in the Relief Society. She was in the state presidency of both the primary and the Relief Society for a time. She had a beautiful alto voice, but they said that she sang a lot, but I guess by the time she got through with us kids, she was wore out because she did not sing much in public after we were. But she always told me that I sang flat. Well, my older sister inherited our piano, and my sister decided to have it tuned. So the tuner come in to tune it, and he said, "This piano is flat, and it has always been flat." So my sister and I decided, because we sang to the tune of that piano was a problem. Because my sister said she got the same story from Mother that I did. But she had a beautiful voice, and her family, all of both my grandfathers played the violin, and both of them were in dance bands when they were young men. But Mother's family in particular was very musical. They all sang, they all played, especially my middle uncle, my mother's middle brother, Guile, played. And I've heard people say that did sing that he was the best accompanist that they ever had, that he was one that was lost in the Second World War. Mother, I don't know. I just love my mother dearly, and I love to visit with her. I would call her, or she would call me, at least once a week, pretty much. Sometimes it'd get expensive, but we kept in touch. And until the day she died, we kept in touch. In fact, I was with her the last 10 days of her life and took care of her. She kept her good looks. Even I had my cousin come to me and tell me that she was the prettiest person she had ever seen in her casket. She said, "I've never seen a more beautiful woman." And she was a good cook, and it was funny because my two cousins always said my mother made the best biscuits they ever ate, and she did. She made good bread. She taught us to make good bread. But then in her elder years, she went up and she'd get the frozen bread. And she would make her when we would go to a family reunion, she'd fly out these frozen breads and make her biscuits. And my cousins would just rave about Aunt Fawn's good biscuits. But that was just a precious thing for us to think that they loved her bread like they did. And they loved my mother. She was a good person. We had cold winters in Snowflake, and we had the regular communicable diseases that everyone had at that day and age: measles, whooping cough. I didn't have the mumps, but the rest of my family did. And, well, there was 3 types of measles, and we managed to get them all. But when I was 8 years old, there was a epidemic of scarlet fever went around Snowflake. I don't know how many of the children in Snowflake had it, but I did. I had it, but none of my brothers and sisters got it. And I was put to bed for 6 weeks. And the doctor had told Mother to keep me on liquids. He meant until my stomach settled down, but Mother kept me on liquids for 6 weeks. And my older sister would sneak me food. When the doctor found out that Mother was keeping me on liquids, I just meant until her stomach settled down. But anyway, I did all right. I lived through it. But my older sister would come out and sleep with me, but Mother wouldn't let any of the other kids come around me because she didn't want them to get scarlet fever. And then as I went into my teenage years, and when I was a sophomore in high school, I got rheumatic fever, and I was put to bed. It was just as school was starting, and I was put to bed again for another 6 weeks with rheumatic fever. And then when the rheumatic fever was over, the doctor told Mother that I could not walk to school because we walked a mile to school up a hill to get to the schoolhouse, and he said that, and so I was chauffeured to school until he turned me loose. I was restricted from all physical activities for the next 3 years of my high school. There was no activity or physical education anything of that nature for the next 3 years of my high school due to doctor's orders because of the rheumatic fever and how long it took me to get over it. The second bout of rheumatic fever, let's see, I think I was about between the 16th and 17th year. And that one was not as severe as the first attack, and it didn't take me near as long to get over it. But again, I was restricted from any physical activities. And I can't remember too much about it, I think because the restrictions weren't so stringent. Then the third attack of rheumatic fever, I had graduated from high school and I had put my papers in to go to the nursing school at the LDS hospital in Salt Lake. And I had been accepted and I had made arrangements with my grandmother's sister and brother-in-law to watch after me while I was there and come down with rheumatic fever the third time. And again, the restrictions were quite severe. And I was put to bed for a period of time, had to cancel my entrance to the hospital, cancel everything I had put on, had planned for that period of time. And then they said that my grandmother's brother-in-law, Uncle George Longson, was so disappointed because I didn't get to come up there and go to school. And that made me feel so good to think that those people would be that kind and sweet and kind-hearted. But then I didn't let that year go completely to waste because in the second semester at the high school, they had a bookkeeping class. And so I took a course in the bookkeeping class that year and come out with a superior rating in that bookkeeping class, which I have used the rest of my life, and I still use it because it taught me so much about finances. And that was not a wasted year. But the next year, when I was over the rheumatic fever, put my papers back into the LDS hospital, they had decided at that time you needed a year of college before you went into their nursing program, and they were graduating their graduates with a BSN degree. So needless to say, I couldn't do that because my grandfather was financing my education. So I put my papers into Good Samaritan Hospital in Phoenix and was accepted there. And then that year, to September of 1949, I went to Phoenix and entered the nursing school at Good Samaritan Hospital. And there I spent 3 years going to nursing school. If I were to tell you everything that happened to me going on through that nursing school, it would never end. That was one of the most disciplinary things that I've ever gone through in my life. Obedience was obedience taught very, very strictly. You had to be obedient in everything you did. I had a habit before I went into nursing school of being late. That was a habit that was broken right away because they did not tolerate late at all. I mean, you could not be late to class. You could not be late to work wherever the nursing program was. You couldn't be late coming in from a date. You couldn't be late. I mean, there was no tolerance for anyone to be late for anything. And sometimes if you were going to class after lunch and you were working on the floor before lunch, you didn't get your work finished, you finished your work. And if you missed lunch, that was your problem. But you couldn't be late to class. So it was a very good experience on teaching all of us to be on time for whatever we had to do. And that was another thing that has hung on with me throughout all my life. Could not tolerate being late. I didn't like it. Can't say that I wasn't late from time to time, but I did not like it. They said that my great-grandmother Staniford was the same way. If she was late, she wouldn't go in. So even if it was to church. So I guess that kind of was a little maybe in the bloodstream. But I had a lot of experiences through nursing school. I learned so much that has lasted and stayed with me all the days of my life and helped me in raising my family, helped me in keeping myself healthy, helped me with things that had happened to my children and things that happened to my husband, and had a lot of able to help a lot of people with problems that they had that they couldn't afford to run to the doctor, or it was very minor and it wasn't worth a trip to the doctor, that I could help them with and give advice to people, and I've enjoyed that. I graduated from nursing school in November of 1952 because our class was the first class in the state of Arizona to get psychiatric nurses training in the state of Arizona, and I was picked to go to the first class, to the first session of the psychiatric training, which was at a private institution in Compton, California. And talk about more experiences. I had more experiences there too, and I had a very good time. Got to know my classmates so well, and other kids from other schools that were coming there for their psychiatric training. And I can't think of anything right off the top of my head that I could tell about. I loved surgery. I loved doing surgery. I loved OB. I liked being a floor nurse, but that was hard work. That was a lot harder work than the other special services. We spent our first year, well, I guess I will tell this little story. We spent 6 months in what they called the probation period. If you made it through the probation period, which all of our professors were from ASU, and the nursing side of it were the nurses were master degree nurses that taught us through the probation period. And after we finished the probation period, we were put on the floors as we could do a full shift on the floor. Well, my first experience after the probation period, we were put on the men's west floor, and it was all men in 3-bedroom wards and 2-bedroom wards, 1 or 2 private rooms, not very many. Well, no, there was about, maybe I'd say 7 private rooms. But our first night on the floor, my partner was a girl named Marianne Freitag. And she had the south end of the floor. I had the north end of the floor, and we had, I think it was about 32 patients between us. And it was from the 11 to 7 shift at night. And I think that was the wildest night I ever spent. We were supposed to have a senior student that was over us to make sure that whatever we needed, we could come to her and she could help us. But it was her night off, so she had to have her day off to get her recouped from her work too. So it was Marianne and me on that floor that night. Well, way early in the morning, this man called me into his room and he said, I don't feel good. Well, we passed out water and toothbrushes, soap and water to clean, for people to wash their face and brush their teeth and get ready for breakfast. Well, as I took this man, and his name was Mr. Hart, I took him in his water and he said, I don't feel very good. And I said, but Mr. Hart, you're going home today. And he says, yes, I know I am. And I says, aren't you excited? Yes, I am. But I don't feel very good. I said, okay. So I went on about my business, and pretty quick the man in the room with him called me back into the room, and he had laid back down on the bed and wasn't responding to me in any way. So I ran out to the nurse's station, which was just across the hall from his room, called the supervisor of the hospital and said, Mrs. Ah, would you please come here? I think Mr. Hart died. Mrs. Ah, come. We checked. Yes, Mr. Hart died. Well, I never did. Mrs. Ah never did let me live that down. She always would, when we'd have a gathering, she was so tickled at me because I think. But anyway, poor Mr. Hart, I felt so bad for him. He was ready to go home that morning, but yet he went home, but not to the home he planned on going to. That was one experience I had and when some man has said, I don't feel very good, I pay a lot more attention than I did that. But that was just one experience that I try to think of some of the others. But the day that I graduated, I'll tell you about my first day on the floor. I went up to 4 West, and it was both a co-ed floor there, not co-ed like we know today. All the ladies were in one room and all the men were in the other. But the patient I was assigned to was a man that was comatose. I went in to take care of this comatose, never had been on the floor before, never taken care of a patient in a bed before, ever. The only experience I had ever had would have been when I bathed my partner on the bed in the nursing lab. And here I was with this man that was comatose. I was supposed to wash his face, shave him, brush his teeth, do all this stuff for him, and he was comatose. Well, the head nurse that was on the floor, her station was right across the hall from where I was at. She could see what a frustrating situation I was in. That lady was so good. She helped me so much with that man. The doctor come in and he said, I said what I was taught. Doctor, what can I do for this patient? And the doctor smiled. He looked at my name and he said, Miss Freeman, just give him tender, loving care. That doctor never forgot my name. Every time I saw him in the next 3 years, he called me by name. After I married, come back and went to work in that hospital, he saw me. He called me by name. I just thought, oh boy, I must have really made an impression. But that was another incident. But anyway, I love nursing. I love the association with all of those girls that were sharing the same goal with me as I was sharing. And I had so many good friends. My roommate was a doll. We lived together for 3 years. Her name was Nancy Thompson. And she's Nancy Myers now and lives in Payson, and we still stay in touch with each other. But the memories, we had another little incident in the dormitory that was kind of funny. We kept sleeping in, and we had to get up and a lot of times miss breakfast to go on the floor because we'd slept in too late, and we couldn't be late to the floor, but we could miss breakfast. That was all right. But this one day we decided that she had a radio that had an alarm on it, and it'd play soft music for us, and we'd sleep right through it. Well, I had an old wind-up alarm clock, and it'd go off, and I'd reach over and turn it off, and we'd be okay, sleep right on. So this one day we decided that we would put it on the top of the bookshelf where we'd have to get up to turn it off before when it started to ring. So that I can still see her face when that alarm clock went off. We both jumped straight up, stood straight up, looked across at each other, and said, "I'll never do that again." But we weren't late. It was so funny. But we had a good time. It was a wonderful experience and one I've never regretted. It was hard. The studies were hard. The work was hard. It was hard to keep your grades up because if you dropped below 75% in any subject, you were dismissed from school. So we kept our grades up, and thank goodness I graduated from nursing school with a grade average of 89.9, which I felt quite proud of. But anyway, that's all I'll say about that. I was torn between being a beauty operator and being a nurse. And when I lived across the fence before we moved into the house up by Grandma. There was 4 sisters. 2 of them were beauty operators and 2 of them were nurses. And this one day I thought, I don't know what I want to do. So I went down, and the one of the younger ones, the one that was a beauty operator, the younger 2 sisters, I asked her, I said, "Minnie, I don't know whether to go to beauty school or to be a nurse. I really am conflicted." But I had already prepared all of the subjects I needed to be either one, to go either way. And she said, "Jeannine, I'm a beauty operator. I went to beauty school. That if I had it to do over again, I would go into nursing because it pays off in so many more ways than a beautician does. And you're a much better help to humanity." And so I went to nursing school because Minnie said that that's what she would have done if she had it to do over again, and that I just made my decision. And I had a lot of flack from my family when I made that decision. I had a lot of flack from my aunts and my uncles. They just thought that I don't know what they thought, but they tried every way to discourage me from going into nursing, and I wouldn't be discouraged. When I had gone about, maybe a year and a half, had gotten that far through of them, my family had all completely made a turnaround in their attitude toward nursing school and nurses. And not only that, but there has been many of the generation of my family go into medicine that from the time I went in, my sister included, and before me, the last person to go into medicine was our nursing school was my great aunt Martha, my grandmother's sister. And I thought, I don't know if I made the turnaround or not, but it affected a lot more lives than I would ever realize by doing that. The first time I saw Delbert was when I was getting over my last attack of rheumatic fever. And Uncle Speed and Dad had been working together on a construction job in Sanders. And Uncle Speed brought Dad to our house on their way up to Taylor, to Grandpa's house, Granddad's house. And it was a long ways for Dad to come down to his parents in Central, but it was quite close there at Taylor. So he went home with Uncle Speed, or he was invited home with Uncle Speed, and he had relatives in Heber too that he would visit. And but he brought him there, and when he brought him, the first time I saw him, he come in, he introduced him. And I thought he had the biggest ears I'd ever seen. But that was, and I didn't was not impressed at all. And we had a good visit with him, and he went on, and then I never saw him again. Well, until I graduated from nursing school, and Uncle Speed brought him to my nursing school graduation. But I didn't remember, and still don't remember him being there. But there were so many people there that it was really hard to remember all the people that was there. Well, I went on to work, but in the meantime, he had decided to go on a mission, and so he was called to a mission in Canada. And he spent the last part of my nursing school career on a mission in Canada. So the next time I met him, I stopped by my grandfather's house to give my Aunt Fern her vitamin shots, because I would give her vitamin shots once a week when I would be on my way back to McNairy to go to work. Well, he was there again, and I met him then. And he asked my uncle, he said, well, it's time for me to get married, and I just don't know how to meet girls. And so they sent him my way. Well, that's all it took. When he come my way, we were so compatible. Our ideals and everything were just along the same line. We just had the same goals in life. So anyway, when I had never been to the Grand Canyon, I had lived to 100 miles from the Grand Canyon, and I was 23 years old, and I had never been to the Grand Canyon. So he thought I should go to the Grand Canyon. So we went, one weekend, we decided we'd go to the Grand Canyon, and we went to the Grand Canyon, and I really did enjoy that. Well, it was after we had gone out and had supper, and we were sitting around talking, then he decided, I was sitting there holding his hand, and he was holding my hand, and he slipped an engagement ring on my finger and looked at me like, is that all right? Yeah, that's all right. So then that was 3 months later. We set our wedding date, and that was the only day. The temple was only open 2 days that summer. One was the 8th of October, the other was the 5th of September. So we chose the 5th of September, and that's when we were married in this Mesa temple. Well, the wedding day was quite a day. We spent the night with my aunt that lived in Mesa. She was just a block from the temple. We spent the night with Aunt Marvine Freeman. She was Uncle Owen's wife, but at that time they were separated. And she was so cordial and so nice. We went into the temple. We had to be there at 7 o'clock in the morning. Well, Dad had a friend that was a temple worker there, and he was working that day. And so he told us, now you sit right up here in these front seats, and you'll be taking one of the first couples in. Well, when the president of the temple was a new president, this was his first day ever conducting affairs at the temple. And so he decided that all of the people that were there to be married in the temple, the ones from the furthest away, should be married first. They should go through the first session because there were so many people going through for their endowments, and that he took all the ones from California, all the ones and I was from Snowflake. I thought that was quite far away, but I found out there was a whole bunch that were a lot further away. Well, he took all these people to go through the first session, but Delbert's friend that was a temple worker, I guess, put a bug in his ear, and we were the very last couple to get to go into that first session. So we lucked out that day, and but it was we went in at 7 o'clock in the morning, and it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon before our ceremony was conducted. Before our wedding ceremony was conducted, my mother and Dad were there. James and Ruth Whitmer were there. My Aunt Marvine was there, and the lady that Muriel Freeman, my dad's cousin's wife, was there, and some of Delbert's cousins were there. And that was the a s it was a small group of people, but they didn't have big, large groups. They didn't have room for them in it. That when they had the room where they did the ceremonies, there was only one sealing room at that time. Well, with all of the couples were ahead of us, the sealer that we had chosen to do our ceremony come to us, and he said, "We have this other sealing room. It isn't near as fancy as the other room, but we can get you through here a lot quicker if you don't mind using that sealing room." So we did. All of our guests were very glad that we made that decision. And then we were married, and we went over to my great uncle Lon, my grandfather's only brother, and his wife Aunt Arfa had a wedding dinner for us, and we went over there, had our wedding dinner, and then we visited some of Delbert's relatives after that, and then we went to Casa Grande to spend the night. I was sealed to my parents before the wedding ceremony, that because they knew that I hadn't been sealed. Well, it was I don't know. It was obvious that I hadn't been sealed. I had gone into nursing school before my parents went through the temple and were sealed to the rest of my family. Myself and my older sister were too old to go through without getting our own endowments, and the bishop from Snowflake had given me the advice not to take out my endowments while I was in nursing school because of the circumstances I would be put into. So consequently, when Mother and Dad went through the 1st of December, 1949 for their sealing, I wasn't sealed to them at that time. Then I was sealed to Mother and Dad just before my wedding. The Mesa Temple was being renovated, and they had just opened the temple these 2 days. There was no cooling, no refrigeration. They were installing refrigeration. There was no refrigeration. There was no swamp coolers, anything in that temple that day that we were married. So it was, I don't know how hot, but I would say 110 outside. And but I don't know. I guess I was on cloud 9, and that was all right. So that was pretty much the circumstances and the weather. After we left Casa Grande, the next morning after we left Casa Grande, we went to Wilcox. Well, we went into Mexico. That was my first experience ever going across the border to Mexico. And when we crossed that border and I was in Mexico, I really felt like I was in a foreign land. I felt like, I don't know, it was really funny, but I just felt like I had to watch out for the bugs all over me. I don't know why, because it wasn't that bad. Then we come across and went on up to Wilcox after we got out of that. Well, I guess we went up to see Delbert's friends, Jesse and Grady Beard. We went up to see them, and then we went on to Wilcox that night and then come on over here. And in the meantime, Delbert's mother and Ruth Whitmer had conjured up a shower for us. And they'd invited everybody in town, and I guess Dad was so old by that time that nobody thought he ever would get married, and so everybody turned out to see who it was that he married. And the one thing I remember about that was when Florine Schurz came and said, "Oh, that's my cousin. I've got a relative in town now." But we had a very nice turnout and got some lovely things. Then after that, we went on up to Snowflake, and our reception was on a Wednesday night. And again, we had a very good turnout to that reception. And then from there, the next morning, we went to Salt Lake. I wanted to go to Salt Lake because I had dreamed of going to Salt Lake for my nursing school and hadn't made it because of illness. So we went to Salt Lake. I wanted to go see my grandmother's family again because they were such good people, such kind and generous people. And we had a good time up there. And Delbert saw some of his aunts and uncles there that he hadn't seen in a long time. Then we left and went on over to California. And it was the first part of September. And if you've ever been up in that country in the first part of September and down through Salt Lake on into California, you've never eaten fruit like they had. Oh, it was so good. Everywhere we stopped, we had fruit. Then we went on into Bakersfield, where had a friend that was on a job there, and he listened for, or he contacted him, and he had work for him. So he told him, well, go on home and get yourself straightened out, come back, and you've got a job. So we come home and put all of our gifts away in Mother's basement, took what we needed, went back to Bakersfield, California, and Dad started working on freeways in California at that time, making, we found a relative of his there that we ended up being good friends. He hadn't known her before the time we lived there, but then we ended up being very good friends for many years after that association with those people. They were just wonderful people. All Dad's people were wonderful people. They're just good, salt of the earth people. And we worked there, I guess, for about 6 or 8 months, and then he was transferred to San Diego. And then when we moved to San Diego, Dad had some more relatives down there on the other side of San Diego that we met and got to know them. And that's where Mark was born. He was born in Mercy Hospital on the 22nd of May, 1954. The things that attracted me to Dad. First, he was LDS. Second, he had served a mission. He was interested in the church. He knew the gospel was true. This was something that I had looked for in a mate. He was also how do I put it, conservative. He wasn't a spendthrift or he had his feet on the ground. He knew what he wanted and he knew where he wanted to go. And it was like the things that I knew what I wanted and the things that I knew where I wanted to go. And that we just had the same goals in life. And they were pretty much along the line of the church, the teachings that we had had. And I think both of us, being raised in small towns like we were, had a good foundation in the gospel and had these goals instilled in us from the time we were young. And I think that's the thing that, and meeting his family, I knew they were good people. I knew that they were, and his mother and dad welcomed me into their family. His sisters welcomed me, and his brother welcomed me into their family. And I felt comfortable around those people, even before I married him. Well, after Mark was born, we stayed in San Diego. I think he was about 2 or 3 months old before we left San Diego. And Dad was transferred then to Colton. I think it was Colton, California. He was transferred from that. San Diego job was just about done, and they transferred him to Colton, California, to a job there. But since we were being transferred, we decided that we would come home for a couple of weeks before he went on over to the next job. And so we come home and spent a week with his family, and then went up and spent a week with my family, and then we went back to Colton, California to start the new job. And we looked for a place to live. and we couldn't find a decent place that we would live in that was for rent. And we kind of missed our families anyway, and we were 2 years into our marriage by this time, and so we decided, oh no, we went to Manteca. I almost left Manteca out, but we lived there for a year, and Dad helped. The ward met in a big hall above a beer parlor, and it smelled like tobacco and beer. But we met there every Sunday. We had our mutual there. They had their primary there, and all of our services were there. And we had a lot of good friends there, and it was just a branch. It wasn't a ward. It was just a branch. And Dad was the Sunday school superintendent there, the Sunday school. And then I was in the mutual presidency there. That was not a very good job for me because I don't feel, looking back on it, I was very ignorant. But that was our jobs in the church at that time. And then we had our friends that were in the construction company too. Well, they decided in the time we were in Manteca to build a LDS church in Manteca. So the job that Dad was on was they were making a transfer from where you come off of the main highway from Modesto into Stockton and went over to San Francisco. And he was on this job, this bridge that was part of this transfer, and they had big equipment there. And he again was a sawman on that job. And then and while they were building this church in Manteca, he put in extra time helping them with the church, with his skills and things that he had there. And it come time to raise the steeple. Well, they didn't know how they were going to get the steeple up. Well, Dad, with his connections with his company, got the company equipment to go raise the steeple on the church and put the steeple in place for the church house with his connections. And then after Manteca, that was when we were transferred to Colton, and we come home again, and then decided then that we needed to come back to Arizona and be closer to family. We came back to Phoenix and lived with Aunt Virginia and Uncle Monk while we were looking for a place to live. And again, the apartments were so shabby and things that we found that we didn't hardly know what to do. But in the meantime, Dad had a job with I don't remember it. I think it was with Ed Webb that he found a job working on houses with Ed Webb here in Phoenix. We were staying at Virginia's, and in the ward that we were in, there was a man that had repossessed trailers and cars and things like that, and he had this Spartan trailer that was repossessed. And we got it for a really good price. And it was, it was a 52, and this was like in 55, I think, that we bought this trailer from him. And then we lived at Aunt Virginia's behind her house for about a year or more. And we went to the ward there with her at that time. And I worked at Good Sam Hospital evenings when Dad worked days, and Aunt Virginia took care of Mark from the time I went to work until Dad got home and could pick him up and take care of him. And she made a little money that way, and it worked out really good for both of us. And she was such a good aunt, such a patient person. I really loved Aunt Virginia. And Uncle Monk was good to us too. When we were in nursing school, both Marilyn and I, he would take us where we needed to go when we didn't have a ride. And they were both really good to us. After we got the trailer, we moved up north into North Phoenix into the Levada Trailer Park. Was it Levada? Loretta Trailer Park. And we were one of the first little family units that moved in there. We were right next to the playpen there. where the little kids had their playgrounds, their swings and all that. They had put in a playground there for the little kids, so that worked out good for us. Lamar had just been, well, first we moved on a place on Van Buren, and we were there for a while, and Lamar was born while we lived there. And he was just a baby when we moved up to the Laredo trailer park. And made good friends with the owners of the park, and they turned out to be really good friends. And it was through them that we met Aunt May, that she was a friend of their family, and she had just lost her husband at that time. And we met her there, but we started our home, bought the place where our home was built, and started our home while we lived at the Laredo trailer park. And it wasn't, then we moved our trailer out of the trailer park over to where would be behind our home, and where Dad could just go out of the house and go to work on the house and come back in and go to bed, then get up and go back to work in the morning and come back and go back to work on the house. He was a workaholic anyway, so that he built our home with the help of some contractors. And when we moved into the house, I think it was of January of '60 that we moved into the house. And he and I were compatible on the floor plan of the house. We liked that, and we did not like to be in debt. We didn't. He bought me a sewing machine before we were married and put it on time payments, and that thing nearly drove me crazy before I got it paid off. I don't remember of ever putting on anything on time payments again until we had to have a car, and I went to work to pay for this car. And after we got that car, I don't remember of anything ever being on time payments except the mortgage on the house. The mortgage on the house was $52.74. I wrote that mortgage check so many times that I can remember it verbatim. But he had a car accident, and he broke his pelvis in 4 places, and was in the hospital for a couple of weeks. And when, I don't remember just how the settlement come about, but we took that money and paid the mortgage off on the house after that car accident, and never again did we have a mortgage or anything that I can remember ever having to pay time payments on. I felt so good. I hated time payments. The whole amount, $8,000 and something. I think we put $12,000 and something into the house by me working and putting extra money into the material so we could have a little better house than what the $8,000 would buy. So we put about $4,000 of our own money into it. But we had saved enough money that when we bought the lot, we paid it free and clear. We didn't have to mortgage the lot at all, just the house.
Mark is the oldest one of my children, and you might call him the experimental model, because these kids don't come with a book. We learned I was going to raise perfect children. They weren't going to do anything that wasn't what I wanted them to do. And I learned with Mark that wasn't so. But he was, considering all, he was pretty easy to raise. He had a quiet personality. And when his brothers and sisters came along, he was very good with his brothers and sisters. If they were out of line with him, he would correct them, but then he would turn around and hug them, give them the reassurance that he wasn't angry, reassure them that he still loved them. And I always thought this was a remarkable trait that he had. He was very dependable. I could ask him to do something as he got old enough to babysit for me, I knew things would be all right when I left with the kids, or felt they would be okay when I got back home. And he was very dependable. He was a good student. He was just a good, easy kid to raise until he got to be a teenager and knew more than I did. But even then, he responded to what I wanted him to do. He was a good student. He liked to study. We used to call him the professional student when he was in college. I don't know how many years he went to college, but he was in college enough years to have a doctor's degree. He enjoyed learning. Well, Lamar, he was frail when he was born up through his probably the first 2 years. He had rheumatic fever when he was 13 months old. Lamar, as he grew older, he was my butterfly. He wanted to explore the neighborhood, and if we didn't know the neighbor, we soon would, because Lamar would be visiting. And it seemed like somebody was always looking for Lamar. He didn't want to study. Lamar was opposite from Mark. He wasn't interested in studying and that part of it, but he liked to take things apart, look things to see what they were made of. If you had a clock, he was into the makings of the clock to see what was inside. As he grew older, he liked motorcycles, and I had a fit when his dad bought a motorcycle. But Dad being a man, Lamar being a boy, they won. He liked motocross. One time he loaded his motorcycles in this box van that he bought, and he painted it with spray paint. And he went, him and Eric Anderson went into the Midwest following the motocross for about a 6 weeks period and really enjoyed themselves. Lamar took to carpentry. According to his father and his brother, he was one of the best when it came to woodwork and carpentry and finish work. He really had a talent there. But then when he got into college, he decided he didn't particularly like carpentry anymore, and he decided to study. He went through grade school in 9 years. He went through high school in 5 years. He went through college in 3 years. So I guess he really decided to settle down and learn. And I was so happy to see that girl when she arrived in my home. We had every kind anybody else did. And I like to fix her up and fix her hair. She didn't particularly like me fixing her hair, but I like to curl it and fix it and get her little pretty dresses. And she was named after her father. I liked the name Lynn. I wanted to tack the name on Lynn. Everybody else was naming their kids Kathy Lynn. I didn't want the Kathy Lynn. So I took the first half of her father's name and named her Dellin, because there was no Dellins in the neighborhood until later. She was a joy to take to church. She was not noisy. She acted like a little lady. She didn't make a lot of noise. Never had to take her out in the hall very much. She was a good student. She liked to study too. She was a good student. She was my helper. I needed a helper. I had 2 boys. I needed a girl to help me, and as she grew along, she helped me. She was in the kitchen. She learned to cook. She learned to sew. In fact, she got to be such a good seamstress, she didn't care for me to make things for her. She'd rather make them herself. And she did a good job. She learned to be a good housekeeper. She learned to be a good cook. She learned to be a good seamstress. Now she's a very good mother and has raised a very good family. Lon, when he was born, he was allergic to milk. He was allergic to the normal formulas of the day. He was raised on soybean milk for the first 2 years of his life, but when about 2 years of age, he grew out of that, and he drinks milk the rest of his life like he had never had a chance in the first part of his life. He was a good kid. He wasn't the studious kids that Delian and Mark were. He wasn't the butterfly that Lamar was either. He was more steady. He had a mind that was mechanical, and he did a lot of the mechanic work on the cars that we had to fix. His dad did not like to do mechanic work at all, and he had Lamar and Lon doing the mechanic work. And around the corner from where we lived, there was a man, Bill Howard, that was a part salesman at Reed Mullins. He would get the parts, and he would tell Lon how to fix the cars, and he even set him up an account at Reed Mullins that was, he called it Ace. His account was Ace, and he called Lon Ace. Whenever he'd see him, well, Ace, how are you? And he learned to fix cars. He took mechanics in high school too. He liked to sing. He was a choir. He sang in the choir. In high school, he sang in the choir and Joyful Noise Choir that was at the ASU. He sang in the Arizona Central Choir when it was functioning. And then he was the one boy that did go on a mission, and I was so thrilled for that. He liked to do things around the house. All my kids helped around the house. They had to. I had kids. They had to help around the house. I think he was more like my father than any of my children even. He looks more like my father than any of the other children do, and he has the talents that I remember my dad had. I'm going to say a little bit about Glenn now, because when Glenn was born, he was mentally handicapped. And this was a very hard time in my life. I had to learn something different, deal with something that I had never dealt with. And it was a learning experience. When Wanda come along, she gave me the confidence I needed in myself. I don't know how to say it, but Heavenly Father knew I needed her. She was good to help. She was good like Delian. She learned to cook. She learned to clean. She learned to sew, and she was a good. Both of my girls were very good helpers where I was concerned. She loved Aunt May. And Aunt May, she'd play with Aunt May, unbutton her dress and button it up back, and Aunt May would say, "That's all right. She's learning to use the buttons," and she was so patient with Wanda. Well, she finished high school. We transferred her from East High over to Camelback and finished high school there. Then when we moved to Central, Wanda moved along with us, and she went to EAC. And the funny part about it was, when she went to EAC, there was more students in her high school than there was in EAC. And we kind of laughed about that. Then she went on to the U of A and then married. Both of my girls are very good to me, but all my kids are, as far as that is concerned. As I say, Glenn was a learning experience. Heavenly Father didn't send him down here for him. He sent him down here for me. He changed my life. I had never thought I would ever, I hadn't thought about ever following in in the care of the special needs people, but he changed my life. It was a part of the population I would never have thought of myself as working in. But when I got into that population and was working with them, that was one of the best things that ever happened to me. It changed me, and I found an area of some of the most wonderful spirits. Glenn was a care. He was something I had to take care of all of his life. He had his physical disabilities as well as his mental disabilities, and we worked with him and helped him as much as we could as a family. And with the help of his father and my children, I think we brought Glenn a long ways. I know we brought him a long ways, a lot longer. He lived a lot longer than he had been. They had said he would. Due to his seizures, his mentality was stymied, I think, and I think that was for a purpose for us, not for him. I had looked for some place for him to learn, and I happened to be working at White Angel Hospital at that time, and there was an aide there that had a child in Mesa at Mark Center, and I investigated that, and then I took him over there every day for physical exercise and mental exercise. I think I was there for about 3 years that I drove that every day. He was there 3 hours every morning, and we'd go back and forth to that. Then he progressed when the school system decided that they would help with the education of the mentally handicapped. And started schools and paying for the education like they did for the normal children. Then I transferred him over to Perry Institute that wasn't very far from our home, and it was much easier. They picked him up on a bus and took him and brought him home. And he really progressed there until he had that seizure at Sharp Creek at a family reunion. After that seizure, he stayed pretty much in the same mental range as he was. He never progressed. He was categorized as a 3 to a 6-year-old. And he did not pass beyond that in his evaluations. But when he reached 13 years old, he went on to high school. They had just started. It was a new high school. They called it Desert Valley High School for the mentally and physically handicapped. He went on to Desert Valley High School, and he loved to socialize. The socialization was the best part of his life, I think. Well, I think all my kids love to socialize. He went on to that until he was 21, and then he had a graduation exercise. In that graduation exercise, the person that gave the talk to the graduates said, now you're graduating, you will go out and you'll work. Well, Glenn, the next morning after the graduation exercises, was ready to go to his job. He wanted to make a paycheck like his brothers and sisters did. They went to their jobs, they got paid. Graham wanted the same thing. And when we moved on up to Central, then he got to go to GCRC. I'll never forget, we hired an administrator at GCRC, and he took Glenn to take his cans he crushed at GCRC. He had them all in a bag, and Bill went down and got Glenn, let's go sell your cans, Glenn. He took Glenn over to sell his cans, and when he sold his cans, the administrator handed him all the money that he got from his cans. Glenn was in seventh heaven. He got a paycheck. And then he moved on. He stayed at GCRC as a job and all the rest of his life, and enjoyed his time at associating with his fellow workers. And if he was sick, he did not want to stay home from work. It took all the staff at the group home, it took all of us, every one of us, to every time he got sick to convince him that he couldn't go make everybody else sick. I was looking for a babysitter one night because I needed to go grocery shopping, and I wanted Dad to go with me. And so we had lived in a trailer park not far from our home, and I asked the lady at the trailer park if there was somebody that she thought could help me, or babysit for me there, an older lady. And she sent me to Aunt May. Bishop was her name, and she came over and babysat for me that night. And we immediately had a camaraderie with each other. I guess you'd call us soulmates, I don't know. We just fell in love with each other, and she come back and babysat for me a lot after that. She even worked with me, worked for me. When I would work, she would come and work and take care of the children for me when I was working. She was a special lady. We adopted her as our grandmother. She would not let us call her grandma because she had never had any children of her own, and she didn't think was entitled to that. Well, the reason I got her in the first to babysit for me was Lon was a baby, and she had just lost her husband, and Lon filled that void that her husband had left. And she and my children filled that void that her husband had left. And I think that was something she really needed at that time. But Lon was the baby of the family. He was about 6 months old at that time. And she just took us all in as her family, and we took her in as our grandma. We stayed very close to her, just as we would have stayed to our own parent, until the day she died. Well, I would like to be known as a good woman that tried the best to do for her family. If they read my history, I would like them to know what I did in my life was for my family. And I hope that they would be pleased to be my descendants. I do not remember when I received a testimony that Jesus was the Christ, that he was and is the Savior of this world, that he is the Messiah. I have no idea. I knew that. I remember going to primary, I knew that. When I went to Mutual, I knew that. I had good teachers in Snowflake, where I grew up and was taught the gospel. I just always knew that we had a Father in heaven, that he had a Son, Jesus Christ, that he was only his beloved Son, and that we had Holy Spirit to prompt us, to guide us, to lead us, to teach us. This was just always part of what I knew. And I've known it all my life. I've experienced it. I've experienced the blessings that our Lord and Savior has given us, not only in my family, but in my associates, and in the many times that I have really needed him in my life. And when he has come across for me so many, many times, I've always felt like sometimes miracles that he's given me with. When I was a young child, when I was a teenager, when I was a young mother,
Well, and when I was in nursing school, I couldn't have made it without him. All my life, he's been there for me whenever I've needed him and asked for help, and he's even helped me when I haven't asked for it. And I know that we have a Father in heaven. I know that he has a Son that he sent to this world to atone for our sin. I know that I'm part of that atonement if I just put it to work. I know that he restored the gospel in this last dispensation of the fullness of times. And I am so grateful that I was privileged to be on this earth. When this gospel was restored, I am grateful. I was raised in the town where my parents, my teachers, the people around me taught me the things that I should know and were an example in their lives. They were an example that I could follow. I'm grateful for the family, the husband he gave me. I'm grateful for the children he blessed our home with. Every day I thank him for the blessings that he gives me, and I know that this is the only way that we will progress onto the celestial kingdom after we leave this life, past this probation period that we're in now. I am so grateful for all the blessings that I've had and still have because of him. I would like every one of my children, my grandchildren, to know how I feel about my Lord, my Savior. I would be so delighted if they all followed the pattern that he set for us. That would be the best thing they could ever give